Our speaker this evening is a psychologist and a psychotherapist. He has a very long association with Dorset Humanists going back nearly 20 years. And David, in fact, was a link in the chain that's made it possible for Dorset Humanists to exist. He was running the group in the late 1990s. I know that we're in for a treat this evening because David's talks are always meticulously prepared and expertly delivered. So would you please give a very warm welcome to David Croman.
Thank you very much. Good evening, and thanks for coming out on quite a chilly late March evening. We found it. We found the answer already. This is the part of the brain, the left part of the brain that is very good at analysing, analysis, mathematics. Of course, there's a right part of the brain as well, the right side of the brain. And we're going to talk about Freud tonight. And Freud was an odd mixture of being almost a total rationalist, and yet at the same time revealing to us the extraordinary depth of the right side of the brain, the emotional components, the desires that we all inhabit, often secretly. Freud was also fascinated by religious belief and belief systems in general for the whole of his life. And you may be quite surprised to hear that Freud wrote more on religion, spirituality and beliefs than he did on any other topic. He fiercely opposed religious orthodoxy, and he kind of made Richard Dawkins into a bit of a pussycat, really. If you read the stuff, people don't tend to read original Freud very much. They read what people said about Freud. But if you read the original stuff, wow, it takes your breath away. There's one particular book I'll mention later, which is kind of an atheist manifesto. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. However, he, as one of the first and certainly the best known psychologists, he put a psychological spin on many of his thoughts and ideas. He wrote in several books around the idea that religion is an illusion, and he linked it to our instinctual desires. Now that sounds all terribly vague, but believe me, by the end of the evening you'll have a much better handle on what this means. That was in 1933. But he wrote other books as well. In 1913 he wrote Totem and Taboo. And what he looked at there was early religious development with totemic figures, quite often animals, and the taboos and the rituals that grew around them that eventually led to formal religion. And in these other books, particularly The Future of an Illusion, which is the one I was going to mention, it's a small book, but as a humanist I think you'll find it highly entertaining because he writes in such an amusing way in this book. Absolutely fascinating. Civilization and its discontents took the whole field much wider, looking at the whole of the development of civilization. Freud was a classicist. He was very well grounded in Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and also in the early development of Judaism as a Jew and Christianity. And he wrote Moses and Monotheism, which wasn't terribly kind to Moses, I have to say, particularly since he was Jewish. What Freud said was that he believed that religions had developed out of animism in some so-called primitive tribes. That's the expression they tended to use when Freud was writing. Less developed tribes around the world there was still animism, and indeed there's still animism today. You've only got to look at the way that Africa has taken on Christianity and mixed it up with their own other religions, and sometimes it contains animism. Animism is basically where you give life to an inanimate object, or you worship an animal of a particular kind. Then he believed it led to polytheism, where people began to worship many gods. And in some cases it became henotheism, which is where you recognize there are several gods, but you believe there's one special God. And then the great monotheistic religions developed, and he had a bit to say about those as well. Here's a question for you, the first question of the evening. How many gods are there in Hinduism?
I would have a guess at 300 million.
You may some people say 46.
Oh.
330 million is about right, yes. Probably you'd be the closest, I would think, David. Certain aspects of Hinduism believes that the gods are sort of inhabit everyone, or all the 300 million Hindus have some aspect of God in them. So it's quite a confusing religion. But other people say, well, there are sort of 46 or 42 or 44 primary gods. But that's certainly an example of polytheism, I think. Now, this is where you've got to be ready for a Freudian roller coaster for the next half an hour or so. Because we're going to dip into some concepts that took me a few years to take on board. So to pick it up and take it on in half an hour to an hour is going to be a challenge, but hopefully interesting. Freud had been dealing with distress, anxiety, and neurosis particularly in his 19th century patients, and he suggested that religion had its basis in neuroses. In some cases, he talked about it being linked to the Oedipal complex, which is essentially where a boy relates to his mother and then later on spurns his mother and to some extent falls in love or respects his father in a much better way. It's obviously linked to the Oedipus myth or the Oedipus story. He felt it gave structure to social groups. Wish fulfillment, that's something we'll be coming back to. An infantile delusion. He talks quite openly about religions being an infantile delusion. And I think a fascinating one is an attempt to control the outside world. And essentially what religion is doing is, in many cases, getting people to use magical thinking, as they call it in psychology, in the belief that magical thinking can in some way have an effect on the outside world. This is the Sistine Chapel, and this is the perhaps one of the classic images of the Christian God, old man with a beard sitting on a cloud, whereas we know that Eric Clapton, of course, is God. What Freud said was that the monotheistic religions had developed out of the need for a powerful father figure. He saw the father as being incredibly important within a family structure. Also, at the basis of most of our anxieties and neuroses is fear. Because we live in this world with essentially a civilized veneer, we can go from day to day without, generally speaking, a lot of fear. But in the past, the world's a dangerous place. Other people were dangerous, animals were dangerous, there was famine, and disease, and it was a very fearful place. And so religions, of course, were quite useful to help expiate some of that fear. We're probably the only species on Earth who recognize our own mortality, have knowledge that at some point we're going to die, although we live in denial a lot of the time, and when we're young we think we're immortal. We do at some level know that we're going to die, and so with some religions offering everlasting life, that's a very useful way of getting around that fear. We all engage in magical thinking. I don't know whether you can think of any examples yourself. Does anyone have a particular number, like a favourite number, or one you think might bring them luck, or one that you like? One or two hands gone up. Yeah, I mean, I'm well aware of magical thinking and superstition, but I know it's terribly cliched, really, but I do like the number 7, and I do like the number 3. So when I go to the gym and I do my exercises, do repetitions, I feel somehow more comfortable if there are multiple of 3 or 7. So if I'm doing repetitions of something, I'll stop at say 18 or 21, 33. How about 33? That's a very good one. I don't have to do it, and I'm not obsessional to the point where I would worry about it if I didn't do it, but I just feel more comfortable if I work within those multiples, and that's a form of magical thinking. And other forms of magical thinking are to do with us believing that we can have an effect on the natural world through our own thoughts, and that's more common than perhaps we realise. Superstition arises quite early in childhood, where something happens and we do something, and it either gets better or it gets worse, and we associate whatever it was, stepping on the cracks in the pavement or whatever, with that event. And also our parents tell us things, injunctions about our behaviour, and they become linked to a form of superstition. And sometimes we believe it for the whole of our lives. But of course religions are deeply embedded in superstition as well. And we mustn't forget the importance of myth-making and folk tales. It's difficult to know with the future of the internet and social media and so on, although I suppose there are lots of folk tales being passed across Facebook tonight, whether the sort of oral tradition of passing on myths about that particular tribe or group will continue into the future. But certainly in the past, that's been very important, and it's incorporated gods and key individuals and key symbols, which once again have been incorporated into religion. So the powerful father figure, just think about that. Think about you as a young person growing up, becoming aware of your parents in the first year or two of life. In many ways you could say your father and your mother were the source of your being. And they're all powerful in many ways. They do control your universe. You're a helpless individual for the first few years of life. The parents offer love. The father offers love, perhaps. Can be kind, merciful and good, and indeed care for my needs. But also there's an element of constraints on behaviour, the lawgiver, and a sense that the parent, particularly the father, is omnipotent. Whereas later on you find out that you're omnipotent, of course. Freud said that we lose that fantasy as we get older. And so Freud linked that with the idea of the need in the development of religions for individuals and groups to look for powerful father figures. And when he looked at the monotheistic religions, there was a powerful father figure at the head of each of those. Obviously, he was aware in the Greek and Roman times that there were many gods, but even within those many gods, there were powerful father figures as well. And he also, of course, being Freud, he looked at guilt, he said the different religions have never overlooked the part played by the sense of guilt in civilization. What is more, they come forward with a claim to save mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. Now, Freud has had possibly more lasting influences than you realise. Some of you will be well aware of his effect. Freud was writing from about the 1860s onward, and he carried on writing right up until the 1930s. And because of the revelation that our mind is largely hidden from conscious access, in other words, we are guided to a large extent by our unconscious, this had an important effect on the symbolism and the storytelling in literature, in art, in film. Look at the early surrealist film, it's just full of Freudian imagery. You can hardly watch a play or see a drama on television without there being Freudian undertones, flashbacks to childhood and the effect that childhood had on adult behaviour. And of course it's had a profound effect on psychology and psychotherapy and indeed psychiatry. One of Freud's nephews moved to America, and he more or less started the advertising business in the 1920s in New York. And he actually incorporated many Freudian symbols and Freudian ideas into early advertising. And of course that's been perpetuated right the way up to the present day, where there are lots of, not exactly subliminal, but rather subtle Freudian images, and some not so subtle, because we all know that sex sells, for instance. Now, how did he get there? How did he come up with some of these ideas? I'm going to just run through, if you don't mind, his biography. Are you happy for that? To see a little bit more of how he arrived where he did. He was born in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. I'm just going to get my pointer, if you just... There we go. Right. Yes, so you've got Namestny Sigmunda Freud, however you pronounce that in the Czech language today. And there's a statue to Sigmund Freud in the central square. It's a tiny place, and most people, of course, think that he was from Vienna, but he moved to Vienna later in life, as we'll see. This is Freud with his family, and you can see that they're not posers in any way. But there's Sigmund, fifth from the left, and a rather dour father who was a wool merchant. Freud was his mother's first son and held a very special place in her life. Freud was a brilliant pupil at school. By the age of 10, he could speak Latin, Greek, German, English, and was well versed in basic science, and was regarded as a leading pupil at the school. But at age 5, in a way, he was able to flower by moving away from this small village to Vienna. Vienna, of course, was one of the most extraordinary places in Europe at the time, full of development and culture. Soon after Freud moved there, they started to take down the old city walls and build these huge boulevards and villas, and it was a millionaire's paradise. And his father was reasonably successful, and Freud was thriving at school. And by age 17, he left school to study medicine at the University of Vienna. Interestingly enough, he trained under Ernst Brucker, who was a reductionist. I'm sure you know what that means. Brucker said, no other forces than the common physical chemical ones are active within the organism. So that was taking a very reductionist approach, saying that we're just composed of atoms and molecules. And Freud very much took on this scientific way of thinking at that time. He changed a bit later in life. And he qualified as a doctor, but he had a bit of a problem. He wasn't very keen on the patients. He didn't really particularly want to deal with patients. A bit like Darwin, really, who dropped out of medical school for the same reason. But he did begin work as a neuroscientist, and he did some original work in neuroscience, neurophysiology, and he developed new stains for staining, histology for staining slides of the human brain and other brains and so on. He read Charles Darwin and became fascinated and a great supporter of evolutionary theory. The problem was that didn't bring in very much money. What happened was he went on secondment to Paris with Jean-Martin Charcot. And at that time, in 19th century Europe, there was a wave of hysteria passing through Europe. I expect you've heard of this. You get these various things that happen during human history, like the dancing fever and things like that. But at this time, particularly amongst intelligent, educated, middle-class women, they were suffering hysterical symptoms. And these were not trivial symptoms. They would go into a catatonic state, they would scream, they would shout, they would start talking in foreign language, they'd become paralyzed. And Charcot had been experimenting with hypnosis. And this is a patient who is suffering from hysteria and has been hypnotized. And Darwin joined him on secondment and learnt hypnosis and learnt how Charcot was dealing with hysteria. And what was happening was that quite often at a certain point of hypnosis and a hypnotic induction, especially if the hypnotist regressed the person back to an earlier part of their lives, they would start shouting, screaming and sobbing, and they would often recall something that happened in their childhood. And Charcot was only touching the... You want to come round and sit there?
Sorry.
If that's possible. Okay, there's one just there, yeah. Charcot by no means found the total answer to this, but Freud took up some of his ideas and began to incorporate them into his own practice, because in Vienna there were many, many women suffering from hysteria. Today we understand that the hysterical symptoms may well have been caused by sexual repression, because there was women wanted to be sexually liberated. They were young, intelligent people, but they had lots of energy and libido, as Freud called it. But there was always the fear of childbirth. Women always had the fear of spending most of their lives in childbearing. Charles Darwin had 10 children. Queen Victoria had 10 children. It wasn't at all unusual. And also, women were feeling educationally repressed because they were getting all this education, but they couldn't get a job anywhere. They weren't expected to work. They were expected to have this education and then settle down and become a breeding machine for the rest of their lives. And so it's thought that because it's known as a hysterical conversion reaction, whereby anxieties in the mind are converted into a physical symptom, that this was due to probably sexual and educational repression, and the fact that they felt that they could not progress as an individual in life. Obviously, we still get hysterical symptoms, and it's not just women that get them. The reason it's called hysteria, is from the Greek word hystera, which is the Greek word for womb, because way back in Greek times, and then later in the Middle Ages, right up to the 18th century, they believed that at certain times a woman's womb would move around the body. They called it the wandering womb. And when the womb moved around the body, they would develop hysteria. So that's why it's called hysteria. And of course there was the woman with the glass uterus who had a womb with a view, but that's another story. These are some contemporaneous examples of hysteria. Freud started working with Ernst Breuer, and they jointly treated a famous case called Anna O, who had just about every symptom of hysteria you could name. She used to shout and scream and shiver and talking foreign languages and the whole thing. The whole thing turned out to have some sort of sexual basis, and that led Freud to think that the more he heard from patients as he took them back in time to their childhood and they started to experience sexual fantasy, or in some cases sexual reality, the more he realized how important sex was in human development. So his two influences were, at that time, were Breuer and Charcot. In fact, Breuer and Freud wrote a book, Studies on Hysteria, in 1895. Now, a little bit of technical stuff here, which I hope you will find interesting. I wondered whether to tell you this, but it's kind of essentially what I'm going to tell you about, and a lot of you know this stuff anyway, is Freud's model of personality, how we develop our personality and the different ways that we balance it internally. It'll become a bit clearer in a minute. So what Freud said was that when we're first born, we have no moral sense. We are interested in surviving and gratification of desires. And so Freud said that a young baby, because it has to survive, it's completely helpless unless it attracts an adult to it to help it survive. And essentially, the baby is saying, I want, I want, I want. And that id, that those desires become incorporated into our personality. And then a bit later on, around about the age of 3 or 4, the child starts developing a sense of its own self. And around about the age of 4, 5, 6, through what parents keep telling it, you know, you must do that, you mustn't do that, you'll get punished if you do that, you'll get rewarded if you do that, we start developing a moral conscience, which Freud called the Uber-S, or the superego. So the superego is the part of our mind that can punish us if we do something, and it punishes us by giving us a feel of guilt or shame. But it can also reward us by helping us feel good or righteous over and virtuous over any good works that we do. So essentially, what Freud said was that we have these 3 elements to our personality development. I want chocolate, you're on a diet, eat a small bar of chocolate. So the ego is the rational part of our brain that acts as a mediator between the 2 opposing parts, the id and the superego. If you're highly religious, you may well, and I mean highly religious, you may well develop a very strong superego with all sorts of constraints. And of course, religions have also laid down dress codes, foods that people can eat, things that they can have to do certain times of day, certain times of year, and all that is helping to develop their superego. There's another example. The id says, I want it now, and nice people don't do that, maybe I can find a compromise. So what Freud said was that this leads to us, you may find it's quite hard to take on board, that having seen hundreds of clients with all sorts of neuroses and anxieties, and fears in particular, I'm a great supporter of Freud's ideas that, in fact, we do live in a world of internal conflict. And so because we live in this world of internal conflict, and particularly fear is always there in the background, we have to do something about it. Obviously, religion can help some people to get through that fear. But what Freud said was, that's all very well, but it means they're not then living in the real world. Now, just very quickly go through a couple of things here. It'll help you understand what I'm coming to next. We look at levels of consciousness. And I'm standing here in front of a bunch of rationalists. You know, what am I doing here? You know, you're all thinking to yourself, I'm totally rational. Everything I do is done through my ego, which is rationally mediating everything I do. And this is the conscious mind. And we tend to think that the conscious mind helps us to operate in the world, and maybe, I don't know, put a figure on it, 80-90% of the time. Just become aware of your breathing for a moment. Just stop for a second and just become aware of your breathing. Before I said that, was anyone here aware of their breathing? And that's because you could become aware of it, but couldn't you? Because when I said it, you immediately became aware of it. So that's what we call the pre-conscious. This is something we can become aware of if we wish, but it's normally outside our consciousness. And then there's the unconscious mind. We tend to use the word unconscious rather than, we don't like the word subconscious, although some people use it. The deepest part of the psyche. And most of the material in there is inaccessible. And that's what people find hard to believe. It contains material as well that we don't allow into our conscious mind. It would just be too painful to face, so we repress it. This is the iceberg model that Freud is quite famous for. And basically what he said was, we only have access to about this much, which is our present awareness. The rest of it, the ego, the superego, and the id, are battling away inside us. Most of it outside our consciousness. Sometimes when we dream, of course, every night, certain things, he said, he called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. He felt that when we dreamt, we could open up some channels from the unconscious mind into the conscious mind, and it would be very difficult to analyze. And of course, icebergs are cool, we know that. So just to summarize this, Freud said that the id operates under the pleasure principle, essentially instinctual energy, demanding recognition and release. The ego operates under the reality principle, and the superego operates under the moral principle. And as we develop during childhood, we're integrating our personality. Our ego is hopefully becoming a good, strong, rational mediator. It's important that we have the id, that we have these desires and we have fun. And it's also important that we know where there should be constraints in our life. But some people are very much in the id, and they're just constantly after self-gratification. Other people are almost over moral in their outlook, and it restricts their life. And so essentially what we look for in healthy childhood development leading into adulthood is integration of those three parts of the psyche. Here's some Freudian slips for you. I heard this a few weeks ago on the Today program, cutting wasting time instead of cutting waiting time. We learned about Freud as a young man. I'm going to Alcoholics Unanimous. And this I heard last October. They were talking about John Prescott's affair, and the interviewer said it happened in 2006. I mean 6. He had to correct himself, which was quite fun. And also, I had an email from someone who was a bit depressed, and they said, "Happy New Year." How about that? So essentially what Freud was saying was that because of the conflict and the anxieties and the fears that constantly haunt all of us in our unconscious, some of this leaks through. In some cases it becomes an obsessive compulsive disorder. In some cases it becomes a neurosis or an anxiety. But he also said that some of it leaks through unconsciously when we're writing something or saying something, even telling a joke. He said he actually wrote about, he analysed jokes to see, he said that sometimes a joke would be a way of releasing something from the unconscious. This was Freud's first slip. So he married Martha Bernays in 1886. They had 6 children. He was fairly moderate, really, compared with many people at the time. And he developed, from his work with Charcot and Breuer, he developed psychoanalysis, the original talking therapy. And this is in the Freud Museum. It's his original couch. It's there in London at the moment. And essentially what Freud did was, Freud didn't like to face patients. It was kind of, looking in their eyes. It That's why he wasn't really that keen on being a doctor. So he developed the idea of sitting behind them. So he did, and also he got them to close their eyes and put them in hypnosis. And then he would just get them to literally talk about whatever was at the top of their mind. And as they talked, you find very often they would go back in time, and some of their anxieties and their fears would start to emerge. And he saw a huge amount of this stuff was because of unresolved childhood neuroses. You may not think this is relevant to the religious thing, but you'll see in a minute. Examination of ego defenses like repression and projection. He wrote a lot about dream interpretation because he thought dreams were the one time when we could have access to our unconscious mind. And in particular, he was interested in childhood upbringing. And so essentially what he found from working for decades and writing and forming groups of psychoanalysts in Vienna and then moving around the world was the importance of early life experiences. He was particularly impressed with the power of unconscious forces. They were far more than he'd ever realized. This is quite interesting from a humanist point of view as well. It's coming to terms with the fact that we're not rational creatures, that just below the surface, irrational man is there. Just think about this country today, which is one of the most stable countries in the world. Think about the riots that took place a few years ago. It didn't take very much for that thin layer of civilization to be broken. Think what's happening in Syria today and in Ukraine and so on, and how quite easily all these rational people all getting on together. Think what happened in Bosnia, where suddenly next door neighbours are killing one another. So we're held by these moral and cultural, political and legal restraints in what we do. But then when society starts breaking down a bit, our irrational side comes out. It's quite fearful. We're very dangerous animals. So Freud realized that we're actually not in conscious control. We strive to be, but we never quite make it. In fact, he developed a specific therapeutic approach, as we know, and he invoked the tripartite model of the psyche, as we also talked about. He also looked at psychosexual stages, which I haven't unfortunately got time to talk about tonight, but just to say that he identified stages of childhood development that would lead to the person being a fully functioning sexual being. And he felt it was important for children to pass through that stage. What he also identified, which is still very controversial today, is that children are sexual beings. It doesn't just all happen at puberty. That's what Freud said. Freud was the world's first sexologist. Many people believe that's true today, but it tends not to be talked about. We're not just talking about sex, we're talking about sensuality, but sensuality with sexual arousal. You know, little boys of 5 playing with themselves, for instance. You know, that's a sexual act that we're all well aware of, but we tend not to talk about. But what Freud said was, for us to be fully functioning human beings, and to meet partners later in life and to be able to function sexually, we needed to pass through these stages. And if any of those stages got disrupted, then it would have an effect, and we might have it will affect our sexual functioning. In some cases, not being able to function sexually at all, or to form intimate relationships. And in other cases, to have rather strange sexual preferences to gain arousal because of what happened to us in childhood. I came across quite a bit of that in my clinical practice, in fact. And he looked at defense mechanisms, which once again we haven't got much time to talk about, but things like repression, denial, and projection, and so on. So here we are. That's the way to do it. Freud's favourite child probably was Anna, his sixth and last child. Anna Freud became a child psychologist in her own right, and in fact the Anna Freud Centre is still in London today. She worked in London for most of her life. And I bring her in for a reason which we'll come to a little bit later on. Freud set up his practice in his apartment in 19...
I didn't know, because there's nothing that patients his couch.
Yeah. Oh, they'd probably arrest you or something, yeah. Well, I have to tell you, thank you. Yeah, I can maybe expiate your guilt a little bit here, because what actually happened was, as we'll see a bit later on, Freud moved across Europe to London and brought all his belongings with him, and so they're all in London, including the couch, and so Vienna then had to try to get stuff back later on, but none of it was there originally. He had all sorts of people around him. This is a US tour. He went on tour with a group of acolytes and spread the word of psychoanalysis to America in the 20s and 30s, and of course it took off in a massive way, and every psychiatrist in America became a psychoanalyst and so on. Just another little facet here, and then we can move back to the religious side of things. I'm just trying to give you a flavour of some of the key things that Freud developed in his ideas. He talked about eros, which is a drive of life, love, creativity, sexuality, self-satisfaction. Libido, the life instinct. And this is extremely important for preservation of the species, that we have this energy. You think of the things that can hold people back. It's very important for us to have evolved this drive, this life instinct, this libido, and indeed to perpetuate the species. Thanatos, by contrast, is the Greek word for death. And Freud lived through the First World War. In fact, 2 of his sons were killed in the First World War. And it just confirmed everything he ever believed about human beings, that it was possible to kill countless millions of people in this extraordinary war, which we're celebrating or marking for this year, the 100th anniversary. And so, following the First World War, he came up with mortido, the death instinct. What he was saying is that essentially human beings, he said we've got 2 key drives, human beings, a sex drive and a drive for aggression. And these are the 2 drives that push us forward. But to live in civilized society, we have to control these drives. That's why we have all these laws. You know, right from the time of Aristotle. Aristotle wrote about this, as indeed did his teacher Plato, that it was important for the city-states to invoke laws that would prevent, particularly men, from putting into effect their drives and their desires. You can't just walk up to someone and have sex with them. You can't murder your neighbour because you don't like them. Freud became aware in the First World War that we've started to invent tools to completely destroy ourselves. And that was even before the atomic bomb was dropped. And he also used the word psychodynamic, and what that means is that our mind is in a state of dynamic energy. We have impulses, we have motives, we have drives and inner conflict. All this is being mixed up, and all of this is attempting to be held in check by the rational part of our brain within the ego. But because of this internal conflict, it can leak through as neurosis, anxiety, and indeed depression. And, extremely common thing to happen. 25% of us will suffer from one of those, at least during our lives. So this is the answer. Freud, I come back to religion now. Freud said that religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis. This is in this wonderful book, The Future of an Illusion. He actually started to write that in 1913, I think, and then it was eventually published in 27. Now, neuroses develop as a way of the mind protecting itself from deep fear, deep anxiety. And what Freud said was that a child is born into a very fearful environment. They don't know what's going on, they have no idea. And they rely to a large extent on prime carers or parents to begin to put them in touch with the world. But Freud maintained that every one of us develops childhood neuroses that we then suppress, repress, or deal with in different ways. And they usually disappear, but later on in life, suddenly someone in their 40s starts getting depressed and they've no idea why. They start getting severe anxiety, they start getting panic attacks, they start developing obsessive compulsive disorder, and they've no idea why. And Freud maintained that a lot of it is to do with unresolved inner conflicts from childhood. And the reason I mention that is that Freud said religion's like that. That as the child is growing up, one way of it, religion's developed as a way of us dealing with some of these neuroses. By saying, we have a way forward, we have a solution, you don't need to worry so much. So Freud said that religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world in which we're placed. And essentially, we live in the sensory world. But the reason we know and are in touch with the outside world is essentially through our senses. But also, he said, there's also a wish world. And what religions offer is a form of wish fulfillment. And if we're offered wish fulfillment, we can think, oh yes, that's great, that's what we want. But what Freud said was, it may seem to be what we want, but it's not real. It'll all become a little clearer in a minute. He also said if one attempts to assign religion its place in man's evolution, it seems not so much to be a lasting acquisition as parallel to the neurosis which the civilized individual must pass through on his way. So he actually linked it, and this obviously got him into a lot of trouble. What he actually says in Future of an Illusion, he says, he's a very amusing writer, and he said, look, I'm an old man now. He said, I know when I write this stuff, I'm going to get brickbats and criticism from all over the world. He said, if when I was younger, that might have affected me, but now, he said, I'm just going to say it like it is, So, quite interesting. These are some of the controversies. Now, bear in mind, he was writing about it in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and yet there's still controversial today. What Freud said was that essentially we're all born with the potential for bisexuality, and that if you think of a continuum, if you have heterosexuality at one end, if you like, and homosexuality at the other, if you want to do it that way, and we move up and down this continuum at different parts of our life and settle somewhere. But even someone who calls themselves heterosexual, if you talk to the police about the men who they arrest in gents' toilets, the majority of them are living with female partners. Many of them are married. And equally, women can be attracted to other women. And so there's a kind of continuum, we move up and down throughout life. Some people become very settled in the homosexual world and quite settled in the heterosexual world. But Freud said something that you can imagine, it's controversial enough today, but saying this 150 years ago, quite extraordinary. He also said that, as I said earlier, that children do have sexual feelings at different parts of their life and sensual desires. That we're not in control of our own minds, that all of us have a potential for violence and aggression. And I don't just mean physical aggression, but I mean something like sending an email to someone that's destructive, writing to someone, arguing with someone, shouting at someone, an aggressive act of some kind. He said we're extraordinarily aggressive creatures, but we're always having to hold that back and restrain ourselves, and that restraint in itself causes anxiety. People have criticised his case study methods for not being scientifically robust, and of course that is true. You can't really do a case study of someone on a couch in a confidential situation in hypnosis and compare it directly with someone else sitting in another room. You can't do a double-blind study, but nonetheless, case studies are extremely important, especially when key things keep coming up time and time again. He said religions were a form of infantile neurosis, and the way that we get around infantile neuroses is to invent a magical world. And that's essentially what he said religion did for us. This is the answer to the controversy. Civilization and its Discontents. This is another fascinating book. And this is I'm sure Richard Dawkins is proud of this one. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. He's talking about religion now. It's still more humiliating to discover how a large number of people living today, who cannot but see that this religion is not tenable, nevertheless try to defend it piece by piece in a series of pitiful rearguard actions. And you can see where he's coming from there, because we have to, I had a conversation with my neighbour this morning. I'm not saying which one, but oh dear. An intelligent person, a former school teacher, highly religious, and I do respect the fact that he's, devout Christian and so on. And he said, I said, what do you do? I said, I'm going to Bournemouth this evening. I thought I did not mention the humanists. So I said, I'm giving a talk on Freud. And I said, oh yes. And he said, oh, he didn't know. No, I gave talks. So I said, yeah, I give talks on Darwin. And he said, oh yes. And he said, I don't believe in any of that stuff. He said, I think it's all, I think, you know, it can't be. He said, this is a direct quote from him, which I thought was fascinating. He said, I was talking to a 90-year-old man some years ago. He'd been around a bit. And he said to me that if you take a small creature, let's say an ant, that ant has a heart and lungs. Not sure he's quite right there, but anyway, he said that ant has a heart and lungs. How could that ant have developed without heart and lungs in that minute little form without God created it in the first place? This was this morning, and I was just about to get my car out the garage, and I said, well, yeah. So I just threw in the fact, I said, well, I think the difficulty some people have is that we've had life on Earth for 3.5 billion years, you know, since the first organism started. And I said, when we talk about creation, you know, I said, we're such a young species, we're only 180,000 years old. But the first tiny, tiny little organisms started 3.5 billion years ago. So I said, in that time, you know, through minute mutations, a lot of change. He said, well, I see that, I know, I can see that. He said, but I still think it's all about creation. So he really didn't want to know. I didn't want to push my point, but it is fascinating. At least the Pope has said that he believes in evolution, which is something. We talked about the symbolism of dreams, the royal road to the unconscious, and I'm sure you've all woken up and thought, where did that come from? Because it doesn't seem to be coming from part of your rational mind. To me, every time we dream at night, we're dipping into the unconscious mind, and it gives us a window into the unconscious that you can, to some extent, access it through hypnosis as well. That's why they used it. What Freud found was that he didn't bother to use hypnosis after a while. The patient was lying down with his eyes closed and he was talking to them, and they went into hypnosis anyway, so he didn't have to. They went into an altered state of consciousness that we all go in. So he ended up not even bothering to do an induction. He wrote 15 books, numerous papers, scientific papers, correspondence with people all over the world. And these are some of his key conclusions about religions. He said they're all human constructions. They act like neuroses to alleviate anxieties. That's what neuroses do. They recapture childhood feelings, for instance, the powerful father figure that we may feel we're losing as we get older. But they also have a cost. They fail to see the world as it is. We can never be truly free if we live within this world of superstition and the supernatural. And he said that we fail to gain full human adulthood, which is quite a thing to say. He said it leaves us in an infantile state where other people are telling us what we should do and think and dress like and eat and so on. In 1923 there was a problem diagnosis. Sigmund Freud was a cocaine addict. If you went to the doctors at the turn of the 20th century, it would be quite common for the doctor to have a pot of cocaine on his desk, and he would spoon it out and put it in the thing. It was this wonderful painkiller. Freud had been taking cocaine for a long time. He also smoked 20 cigars a day. But unfortunately, the cocaine, and particularly the tobacco, was breaking down his palate and his nasal cavity. This is a contemporary advertisement. 15 cents, toothache drops, cocaine. For sale by Walter Ferguson. No, it was a terrible, terrible thing to happen. And it happened, bear in mind, in 1923. It involved enormous pain, ended up with him having most of his upper jaw removed, into absolute agony for a long time, decades. He had operation after operation after operation, but of course it was fairly primitive surgery in those days. They were still living in Vienna in 1938. Anna Freud was arrested by the Gestapo and finally released. They also, the Nazi brown shirts came to his apartment and demanded to come in. And Freud stood up to them, and amazingly enough, they didn't destroy his stuff. They eventually left. But Vienna, of course, was full of Nazis after the Anschluss in 1938. And so Anna Freud said that Freud himself was no youngster, Sigmund Freud. So she arranged for him to escape with his wife and children to London, by train actually, but also to get all his belongings sent to England. 4 sisters remained in Vienna, and they were later killed in concentration camps. Freud said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages they would have burnt me, now they're content with burning my books." The Nazis piled up his books in the streets of Vienna and burnt them because he was Jewish, not because of what he said. The Freud Museum in Hampstead is well worth visiting. There's far more original stuff there than in Vienna. 20 Maresfield Gardens. This is his original couch and study. I used to take students there a couple of times a year at one time, and they always found it fascinating. Freud died of cancer in September 1939 in London. In the end, he persuaded a physician friend to give him a morphine overdose. His ashes remain in a Greek vase in Golders Green Mausoleum and Crematorium, as indeed do Anna Freud's. And so, I know I've had to rush through this, and there's a lot to take on board, but this is some of Freud's legacy. He identified the extraordinary power of the unconscious mind, even though we, by its very nature, are unaware of its power. For instance, what they've discovered in neuroscience recently, by using CT scans and getting people to make decisions while they're being scanned and things like that, what they've discovered is when we think we've made a free decision, when we have to decide, for instance, to go left or right, what they've found is that, and they know the part of the brain that makes this decision and lights up, what they found is that milliseconds before we make that decision, another part of our brain lights up in our unconscious. So the unconscious makes a decision, passes it through to us, and then we think we made the decision. The influence of childhood experience, and as I say, any film and drama these days tends to reiterate that. This inner conflict can lead to psychopathology, anxiety, phobias, neuroses, depression, and even perhaps psychoses, although the cause of those is not totally known. And so it is quite amazing when you think that we've got this turbulent inner conflict, and yet we've managed to succeed, build civilizations and cities, and achieve what we have in the short time we've been on Earth, actually. He developed a range of psychotherapeutic techniques. He identified the importance of our dreams, our desires and our drives, and he also challenged religious orthodoxy. He also said, incidentally, why was it that none of all the pious ever discovered psychoanalysis? Why did you have to wait for a completely godless Jew? So there we are. Siggy is just waving us goodbye there, and it's almost the end. But just need to read this. There's nothing else to see. Go back to work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Are the cocaine drops and toothache still available? Do you know of anywhere we can get them?
I think I know someone who could help you out.
Okay. I'll have a word later on. And when you put the picture up of the Freud Museum and the couch there, I'm sure I could see the distinct impression of where Francis had actually sat on it. So, still there, Francis.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah.
Okay, now there's some time for questions. The rule is you cannot speak unless you have the microphone. And when you do have the microphone, hold it to your mouth the way I'm doing now. Don't just gesticulate with it, because then we won't be able to hear you. Okay, so David, do you want to take one at a time?
Right.
Yeah?
Whatever.
Any questions?
You
Well,
decide.
I'm assuming there will be some questions. So who wants to go first? Yes, Paul. Let me just come to you.
David, thank you. That was very interesting. This may seem slightly off the main point, but you mentioned 2 or 3 times that some of the hysterical patients in the 19th century spoke in foreign languages. Was there any reason to suppose they should have known those languages? And if in fact there wasn't, did Freud draw any speculations from that?
Yes, it's a very good question. It turned out in lots of cases that they had learned foreign language as a child, and then they left it alone, and it sort of became a third language. There were some cases where Freud said he couldn't understand how articulate they were in this particular language that they seemed to formerly have had very little knowledge of. And as you know, there's a psychological condition which is something like called foreign language syndrome now, where people suddenly flip into a foreign language and start speaking it, and they can't, that's all they can speak, they can't speak it. It's quite rare, but it does happen. But Freud didn't really investigate that too much. He wasn't too interested in that. He was more interested in the underlying anxieties that caused it. Essentially, what psychoanalysis is about is identifying the cause, the original cause, rather than just covering over the cracks and saying, you know, brace yourself together, or there, never mind. It attempts to go back and find the cause. And if you do find the cause, you can get the most extraordinary thing, which is called an abreaction, where the person releases all this pent-up anxiety and from the past. It happens a lot with patients who have been abused as children, for instance, but it's the most extraordinary sight. And of course it doesn't work every time, but it does seem to have this release seems to be very important in helping people to come to terms with their issues. What Freud identified was that what we think, you know, if we get depressed in our 40s or 50s, we tend to look at what's going on in our lives at that time and think, why have I got what's known as free-floating anxiety? Why do I feel depressed when things seem to be going fairly well for me? And what Freud uncovered, or discovered, was that it's leakage, if you like, from the unconscious from many years ago, unresolved conflicts and so on. That's what he said, and you may or may not believe that. But yeah.
Okay, come back to you.
Strangely, you've just said, I know this is quite a personal thing, my daughter at the moment had a hysterectomy yesterday, and she's only 40, she's still in hospital, so I've come here because I know it'd be so interesting. And there's been a whole, you know, she's been waiting for it, and eventually had to pay to go private, she was into trouble. She feels very, very sort of almost hysterical, you know, and today I had to phone her, and she said, I feel totally, totally different. I can't even explain. She's almost bereft. So there is this thing about an actual womb, I think, you know, that for a woman is more significant than, you know, because men obviously don't have one, but it does tie in with this thing of being feminine, being a sexual person. And she knows she'll have to work through this with therapy or without, but she said she really, really had struggled to have it done. She kept putting it off. Eventually she had to have it done. And you know, as I say today, she was really, so I can relate to this sort of hysteria being connected with the womb.
I think we have
sort of straight
yes, thanks for that. I'm very sorry to hear that news about your daughter. What I think we have to distinguish is us saying, oh, that woman has got a bit hysterical because she's sobbing and crying and being anxious, and hysteria. It's a totally different thing. Seems to me that your daughter's experiencing a great sense of loss. And, it's almost like you need to go through a bereavement and so on. And there will be anxiety and all sorts of things associated with it. I'd be reluctant to ascribe the word hysteria to it. As I say, that's where we get into trouble, because we use the word hysteria and, you know, well, that person's hysterical. That's not what hysteria is. It's known as a conversion reaction. And it's, I mean, for instance, in the First World War, men were coming back from the First World War blind. There was nothing wrong with their eyes. They had a hysterical conversion reaction inside their mind, and they just couldn't face the world anymore. So these conversion reactions are protective, and the way the brain protected the person was by making them blind. They just couldn't face seeing what they'd seen anymore. Men would come back dumb. And I'm sure you've seen those pictures of soldiers from the First World War in the nursing homes in catatonic states, shaking, shivering, exhibiting all these symptoms that the women who suffered from hysteria did. And this was a result of war. But it's quite a serious thing, and you can literally be struck dumb or struck blind. You can even have hysterical deafness. You can't even hear. But it shows the power of the unconscious mind.
Did the same thing happen in the Second World War?
Yes. Not quite so badly, but it did, yes. And it's happening now. You know, the wars today.
I've got a brother who emigrated to Australia 50 years ago. And when my father died, he wasn't here, of course, and he hadn't spent an awful lot of time with him because he'd been out there 30 years or more. And a year after my father died, he suddenly became obsessed with the fact he hadn't spent any time with my father. And he's been in and out of deep depressions for the last 10, 15 years. You know, so I can support your principle.
It can be a form of unresolved guilt. No?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I'm a firm believer that the mind absorbs everything. Everything you see, everything you hear, everything you say is in there. What other people say to you is in there. The fact that we can't retrieve it, and as we get older it becomes more difficult, you know, what do I come up here for, that type of thing. But if it's all in there, the unconscious mind must be controlling the complete body. I mean, we don't have to remember for our heart to beat, do we? We don't have to remember to feel pain. The unconscious mind
controls a lot of the autonomic functions, yeah. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk on Freud, and I have great respect for his work. But I actually am a Jungian. So I just wondered, I mean, their relationship, it's tragic, it seems to me, what happened between them.
Yeah.
It was a father-son thing, and they had no one really to help them with it. But it is also because I presume that there are such different people. I mean, you went into typology, and different people see and perceive and understand the world differently, and as I expect many people know, Jung came to a very different conclusion about religion than Freud did. But he also, I mean, I would support a lot, I'm sure he would, a lot of what Freud said, you know, that Jung felt you had to go on your own. If you go fully into individuation, become as mature as possible, then you don't hang on to the trappings of Orthodox religion, but you have to kind of your own almost inner experience of the divine. So I just wanted to make that point. I wondered how you, think.
Yes, just very briefly on that. Freud and Jung corresponded for many years before they met. They used to write these long, involved letters, and then one day they met, and Jung came to visit Freud, and they talked together non-stop for 12 hours. And they went through a series of what you might almost call, oddly enough, supernatural experiences, because their connection was just so extraordinary. And Jung became very much an acolyte of Freud, as did many others. But then people like Adler and Ferenczi and other psychoanalysts started to form their own fields. Jung was Swiss and he was a Protestant. Most of the others were Jewish. And Jung was dealing with psychotic patients. He was dealing with madness. He was a psychiatrist. He didn't see so much of the neuroses that Freud was seeing. When Jung was interviewed, he was asked, "Do you believe there is a God?" And he said, "I know there is."
He said, "I don't believe, I know."
I know, exactly. I know, yes. He did in this famous television interview in London. You know. So, no, at his home actually. But anyway, so Jung is an important figure. I'm a great supporter of Jung's ideas, particularly his idea of symbolism and so on. But and he was able to balance that with religious belief. Freud wasn't, so that there was quite a division. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting talk, and there's a general feeling that Freud's sort of analysis is very widely accepted now, but at the same time his treatment methods have, you know, a lot of people have said you can spend years and years getting psychoanalyzed, you know, what's the ratio of curing. And so one thing I'm wondering is that it was very powerful when you described the ab reaction, what can happen when, as it were, a boil is lanced somehow.
Yes.
But do you think certain religious cures, sort of miraculous cures, even some of the things that happened in the Bible, are actually very similar?
I do, yes. Rather like some of the rituals they performed, you know, where they touch someone on the head and they fall backwards. That's just extreme suggestibility associated with hypnosis. You're just putting the person into a hypnotic trance, but they ascribe a supernatural element to it. Some people go into analysis not because they have any great anxieties and never experience an ab reaction, but they do it for just self-exploration, and they go through a journey. And it's possible to do a shortened form of that, maybe over 2 or 3 months. It can last a few years, but in my experience, it's almost always beneficial to find out more about yourself and where you've come from, what influences have affected you, and so on. But yes, it's a big area. One of my best friends is a consultant psychiatrist, because psychiatry started to move away a bit from psychoanalysis some years ago. He's I won't say who he is, but he was quite a prominent family psychiatrist, child psychiatrist in London. And he said he could never have done his work over decades without having Freud's ideas in mind, because he sees time and time again within the family dynamics, you know, the power of Freud's ideas. But I agree, not everyone goes along with that.
I just like to draw a parallel, perhaps, between Darwin and Freud. Darwin was, of course, totally unaware of genes.
Yes.
Freud was totally unaware of biochemicals, neurochemicals. And it seems to me that what he did was give us a language to be able to talk to people about what they were feeling and to be able to then communicate that to a therapist. But that really, you can't talk to somebody about lack of serotonin really very convincingly. So I think that his biggest achievement was really giving us a language rather than actually being true, if you like, whatever truth is.
Well, yes, if you're just looking at levels of serotonin and then you're giving SSRIs to affect that serotonin, that's a very reductionist approach, you know. And there is a place for reductionism. Medicine is almost all about reductionism, actually, modern medicine today. But we also inhabit the world of symbols and feelings and anxieties, and you can't just take that down to a reductionist level. You could say, oh well, some of your molecules have moved the wrong way or something, but you know, we need to have, as you say, a sense of understanding. And also we have to be able to describe relationships and what goes wrong within relationships and so on.
Well, just to come back, nowadays we have the language of computers. We have information processing, we have dual root processing, we have fast and slow thinking. What I was really saying is that Freud hasn't his language been replaced in many ways, certainly in academia, but that his contribution was to provide us with a repertoire of language that we could use with patients.
Yes,
but they really aren't based, they're not evidence-based at all. Well, based on what we can Vienna.
Yeah, well, those are what he wrote up, and there was a lot more. I just very quickly say what you have to think about is that these are conceptual models. Okay, a model doesn't mean it's the truth. It's just a way. It gives us a body of ideas and descriptors that allow us to understand very complex systems. And in some ways, it's easier to talk about the id, the ego, and the superego, whether they exist or not, to help us understand the way that we develop, rather than looking at it in terms of the systems analysis, which they tried to do in the 70s. They brought in, as you know, the systems approach in cognitive psychology and so on. And oddly enough, they're now moving more back to Freud and some of his ideas. Because of neuroscience is revealing that some of this seems to have some basis in science as well. There's an article, if you want to look back, in New Scientist, 5 years ago or so. They did a whole issue of New Scientist just on Freud, and they linked it to modern neuroscience. Very interesting.
Who was next? Someone at the front, I think. Dave? You've mentioned hypnosis quite a lot this evening, both from your own reminiscing and in Freud's work. What are your views on that? Because I've seen quite a bit of debate even in academia about whether a hypnotic state really exists.
Thank you, yes. Well, you might... some people argue it doesn't exist, but we pass in and out of altered states of consciousness right through the day. We're not being hypnotized, but if you've been driving your car and you pull up at traffic lights and you think, what happened to the last 5 miles? Has that happened to you? And you've been driving perfectly safely, but you've no recollection of what happened because you've been on automatic pilot. And it's not passed into your short-term memory. And it can be a bit frightening sometimes to think, you know, what's happened to that. But the fact is you're in an altered state of consciousness. And altered states of consciousness can be demonstrated. But I know what you mean. I mean, you can... there was something on television a few weeks ago where they showed this chap who had a phobia to needles, but he needed a wisdom tooth out. And so he went to a dentist who specialised in hypnosis, and he prepared him with a few, did you see that? Prepared him with a few sessions, and then he, without any anaesthetic, without any preparation at all, just putting him in a hypnotic state, he took out quite a difficult wisdom tooth that needed sort of gouging out, and the chap felt nothing. So you can
I think he had the cocaine.
you can invoke anesthesia, and you can invoke lots of things. Now you may say, well, it's all in the mind, but of course it is, yeah. But altered states of consciousness are really important, and meditation is another form. But having worked with hypnosis myself for decades, it's just a very useful way, actually, of, I think, opening up channels into the unconscious. That when we're totally rational, is sometimes not possible.
Paul wants a second go, but was there anyone waiting? Okay, I'll come back to you, Phil, in just a moment.
I would have been sceptical about hypnosis up until about 5 years ago. My youngest daughter, who was an avid smoker and time again tried to give up, and tried patches, all sorts of medication. And I suggested to her, just out of the blue, not because at the time I had a lot of confidence in it all, I said, why don't you see a hypnotist? She went to a hypnotist once for 3 hours. He spoke to her, cost £135. He didn't put her out or anything like that, just spoke to her for 3 hours. You can't get her near anybody smoking or a cigarette. Stopped just like that, which I found absolutely unbelievable. But you must accept that hypnosis is real. You can't.
Well, she may not have been put out, as you say, but she's probably in an altered state of consciousness, actually. Well, people get mixed up with hypnosis. They think you're asleep. You're actually more alert and more in touch, but you're highly focused.
Yeah.
It's a heightened state of consciousness, actually.
Well, I do a lot of yoga and I do a lot of meditation. And friends of mine have said, oh, but when you get a cramp, you can just switch it off like that and it goes away instantly. That's self-hypnosis, but whether it is or not, I wouldn't know.
Thank you.
Come back to you in a moment.
Before 14 minutes past, huh?
Yes,
that's quite a
2
lot.
minutes.
We've got time.
I think speak for Freud.
Yes,
Could you speak up a little closer? Oh, hi, hello.
I think the idea of the Oedipus complex did a lot of harm because Oedipus was a grown man who murdered his father, not knowing it was his father. He married his mother, not knowing she was his mother.
Yeah.
This is a Greek tragedy, but it's completely different from the feeling of a young baby who, I think, is attached to his mother, not sexually, but merely as something that's not himself and is a source of milk and comfort.
Okay.
Sometime before a baby develops the idea that something that's not himself is actually another person. He then goes to the stage where he's so attached to that person that he's resentful of any interference from somebody else, which is when he starts to resent his father. But by describing that as infantile sexuality, I think Freud put all sorts of silly ideas in people's minds which shouldn't have been there.
Okay. Yeah, he was more, the infantile sexuality wasn't just to do with his mother, with mothers. No, he, as a Greek classicist, he just used that as a name, and unfortunately, and obviously it's only loosely linked to the original original Greek tragedy. But he was saying that with children, and not a lot of people don't agree with it, that there is an attachment, and at some level, you see, when people hear the word sexual. What Freud, it's sometimes lost in translation, what he said a lot of the time was sensual. And children can have sensual feelings toward their parents. And at some point they have to move away from their mother, and if it's a boy in particular, he really needs to then start taking on some of the attributes of his father. And so he said there's a switch from mother to father. But it's a complex area, and I don't think it's that highly regarded now as a total explanation, but something like that seems to happen. But don't take it too literally.
My second point, if you could hear me,
I can, yes.
is that I think Freud pictured religion as producing an alternative father figure, people whose conscience had been at first produced by their attitude to the controlling parent, the father. And one of the beauties of religion is that if you are afraid of the father figure, it's enormously helpful if you can have a father figure that doesn't exist.
Thank you for that. We'll make it brief. Thank you very much. Yes, you're working, you're okay.
I was just wondering how, in the final analysis, you felt about the assertion that Sigmund Freud is the most debunked doctor in history.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's kind of said now, is it? He's still highly respected. There was a period, as I said earlier, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, with the rise of computers and information technology, and they started to see the brain as a machine. And we've kind of moved away from that now. We're realizing that anxieties and emotions and conflicts and desires are important, that we can't just look at it in reductionist, machine-like terms. I don't agree with that assertion, because I don't think it's true, actually. I think he's still highly respected around the world in many circles. But what he says is difficult. It's high, and what you have to remember, as I say, that people find this difficult to get their head around, is that what we're talking about is our hypothetical constructs. We're not talking about the truth here. We're talking about conceptual models. But a conceptual model is not the truth. It's an explanatory device. Okay? It helps us to talk to one another about things. It doesn't mean that in my head I've got a superego sitting there that big. But spread throughout our mind is a tendency for me to feel guilt or shame or a sense of virtuousness. And it's just